Hi everyone, I hope you are all well and you actually had a quite good break. This is Ms. Makwetu here. I will be taking you for the rest of the semester. Our first lecture together is going to be on decolonization. This lecture is going to be broken up into two parts. So, before we get into what is decolonization, I just want to tell you that decolonization is the most significant events or processes of the 20th century. Long-standing European empires in Africa, Asia, and beyond were largely dismantled to create dozens of new nation-states, and with them, a new geopolitical landscape. Excuse me. The magnitude of change was immense. In Africa alone, more than 50 new states were created beginning in the 1950s. The process of decolonization, which started after World War I, utterly reshaped the world. Rather than occurring as coherent events, decolonization varied from country to country in its shape and in its duration, and it has been evaluated in many different ways over time. As we go through decolonization, we need to keep these questions at the back of our heads. Is decolonization complete? What replaces former colonial controls after independence? Are Western historical frameworks adequate to describe decolonization? So if you wish to understand the shifting political world of the 20th century, it is impossible to understand it without recognition of the decline of Britain as a global superpower. This was both a structural transformation and a political and ideological one, as the Western powers moved at this time from systems of formal imperialism or political control of colonies towards a system of informal imperialism, or via control via economic dominance, via the control of markets, via the protection of private business interests. So the decline of European imperial powers was, in other words, a major, highly transformative event in the 20th century. It marked a revolution, a call to Black political and cultural liberation. By the interwar years, Britain held the largest imperial system the world has ever seen. This came to an end in a remarkably short period to time, in some areas peacefully, relatively cooperatively, and in others not so peacefully in places like Kenya. We saw years of guerrilla warfare, civilian deaths, and social unrest in places like Kenya and Malaya. Within 20 years of the ending of the Second World War, a revolution seemed to have taken place. Nearly all of Britain's colonial territories had become independent. So, before we get into the definition of decolonization, from a historian's perspective, decolonization was one of the most important political developments of the 20th century. So, until World War I, historical writing had been the work of European conquerors who made the world appear to revolve around Europe. With a few exceptions, the regions outside of Europe were seen to be inhabited by people without the kind of history capable of shaping the world. The process of decolonization, which began towards the end of World War I, was accompanied by the appearance of national historical consciousness in these regions. The timing and the patterns of decolonization were extremely varied, and the goals of the movement in different countries were not always consistent with each other. So, decolonization refers to the process whereby colonial powers transferred institutional and legal control over their territories and dependencies to indigenously based, formerly sovereign nation states. So, decolonization is often defined as the retreat of European colonialism. Coined in an academic encyclopedia in the early 1930s, the term gained traction among politicians and intellectuals after World War II, as it became synonymous with the end of European colonial rule. In a strict sense, the phrase refers to the process where an imperial power, having conquered and imposed its will upon a territory, transfers control of that land to a legally sovereign national state. So, it is a process in which a country that was previously a colony controlled by another country becomes politically independent. It is the action of changing from colonial to an independent state. So before we start unpacking decolonization, let's start with the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan writing a private telegram to the Australian Robert Menzies. He says in the telegram, by folly and weakness on the one side and incredible wickedness on the other, Europe has twice pulled itself to pieces in a single generation. I do not think the loss of life, terrible as it has been, especially since it always takes its toll on the best, has been the chief loss. Nor does the squandering of money and materials amount to such. These can be replaced. What has really gone is the prestige of the Europeans, British, French, Germans, call them what you will, whether in the Old World or migrated to the New World or settled in Australasia or in Africa. Europeans have broadly governed the world for over 2,000 years in a more or less coherent unit. But as I say, what the two wars did was to destroy the prestige of the white people. For not only did the yellows and blacks watch them tear each other apart, committing the more frightful crimes and acts of barbarism against each other, but they actually saw them enlisting each their own yellows and blacks to fight other Europeans, other whites. It was bad enough for the white men to fight each other, but it was worse when they brought in these dependents. And what we have really seen since the war is the revolt of the yellows and blacks from the automatic leadership of the whites. So Macmillan is a man brought up with the British Empire. He blamed the world wars on the end of European global dominance, or the end of, as he imagined it, more than 2,000 years governing the world. So this is the end of European legitimacy. Another quote I want to read to you is a Caesar quotation. However, now in this quote, note he's a Martinique post-colonial theorist. He points to the process of decolonization itself, the efforts to maintain colonial rule again, national opposition, the torture and the violence that European powers used proved that the supremacy of Europe as an idea was over. So Caesar says a civilization that proves incapable of solving the problems it creates is a decadent civilization. A civilization that chooses to close its eyes to its most crucial problems is a stricken civilization. A civilization that uses its principles for trickery and deceit is a dying civilization. The fact is that Europe is unable to justify itself either before the bar of reason or before the bar of conscience, and that increasingly it takes refuge in a hypocrisy which is all the more odious because it is less and less likely to deceive. Europe is indefensible. Apparently, that is what American strategists are whispering to each other. That in itself is not serious. What is serious is that Europe is morally, spiritually indefensible. And today, the indictment is brought against it not by the European masses alone, but on a world scale by tens of millions of men who, from the depths of slavery, set themselves up as judges. The colonialists may kill in Indochina, torture in Madagascar, imprison in Black Africa, crack down in the West Indies, but the colonized know that their masters are lying, therefore their masters are weak, and the principal lie, which is the source of all others, colonization and civilization. So these two quotes point to an idea of the end of Europe's global project, an end to the belief in the innate superiority of European civilization. We can't understand the swift process of formal decolonization of the British Empire without thinking about World War II and the Cold War. Along the way, as we go through the history of British decolonization, we will see competing ideologies at work, attempting to define and redefine the imperial relationship, attempting most of all to remake British imperialism to fit new political context. Now we're going to be looking at the Second World War. We will look at the dramatic impact of the Second World War. So let's turn to the war's impact on the British Empire. So the Second World War required the mass mobilization of Britain's colonial forces. Various parts of the empire, from India to South Africa to Australia to Canada, contributed their manpower and natural resources to help the Allied war efforts. British authorities became, in an effort to rally these resources, far more intrusive than they had been in the past, which inevitably produced friction among colonial populations. Like in Britain itself, the British government had to convince the colonies that what they were fighting for was worth it. They had to win over the hearts and the minds of the people. In the context of the Second World War, we see an unprecedented, massive propaganda campaign to sell an idea of the empire to colonial people. Within the war effort, the British had to rebrand the empire. They had to sell it as something that ideologically stood in grand opposition to the threat of fascism. Nazism had to represent the greater enemy of the British Empire. So this was done for a clear reason. So the Axis forces, Axis powers, the coalition headed by Germany, Italy, and Japan that opposed the Allied powers in World War II were themselves able to convince some colonial subjects that their interests lay not with the British but against them. In many propaganda pamphlets, the Axis powers insisted that fascism stood for national interest against American and British imperialism. The Japanese propaganda, for instance, sought to stir up resistance to British rule in Asia. Magazines, leaflets dropped from the skies portrayed the British presence as motivated by greed. The Japanese declared themselves leaders of an Asian resurgence against what they described as Anglo-American economic and cultural imperialism. Historical incidents such as the Arista massacre in 1919, when hundreds of Indian protesters were killed, when the British general Reginald Dyer ordered soldiers to open fire were exploited to claim that the British could not be trusted. The British, Americans, Australians, and others countered Japanese propaganda with their own. The Japanese were depicted as menacing world trade and freedom, and racist stereotypes were exploited to imply Japanese inferiority. Importantly, Japan's efforts was successful at various moments. So now, for instance, here's an example in 1942, when Japanese forces advanced into Singapore, Malaya, and Hong Kong against the British. Some Indian soldiers fighting for the Allied side became Japanese prisoners of war. Some of these Indian prisoners of war were convinced by the Japanese that their interest would be best served by forming an Indian National Army supported by the Axis powers. The aim of this new nationalist army was to secure Indian independence with Japanese assistance. Though initially composed of Indian prisoners of war, the Indian National Army later drew volunteers from the Indian expatriate population in Malaya and Burma. Though not militarily significant, with only 11,000 troops by 1943, it was politically and symbolically significant as it seemed to represent the limits of Indian loyalty to the British. As I had stated, this began in Asia and in particular in the countries occupied by the Japanese. The Japanese began by incorporating European colonies into their own empire and harshly repressed any attempt at resistance. But when things started going badly, the Japanese tried to encourage nationalist uprisings against the European colonial powers by declaring the occupied territories independent. Burma and the Philippines in 1943, Indonesia in 1944. In all of these areas, this was widely recognized as a sham, but nevertheless, the Japanese ousting of the colonial power had destroyed its legitimacy, demonstrating that Asians could defeat the European occupiers. So it stimulated nationalist resistance movements. In 1948, the British agreed to Burmese independence, not least because the function of Burma as a buffer state to the east of India had now disappeared with Indian independence. In the Philippines, the Americans had already announced the intention of granting independence in 1935, and the Japanese invasion merely delayed the event until 1945. The Dutch in Europe urged Dutch troops to sign up to free the Dutch East Indies from Japanese control, meaning to get them back under Dutch control, but Indonesian nationalists led by Sukarno declared independence, and after a lengthy and bitter war costing the lives of more than 20,000 Europeans and many more Indonesians, international pressure forced the Dutch to withdraw and recognize Indonesian independence in 1949. Now, in French Indochina, also conquered by the Japanese, the situation was also similar. French rule began to disintegrate as the Kingdom of Siam or Thailand, which had managed to remain independent by playing off the British in Burma to the west against the French in Cambodia and Vietnam to the east, persuaded the French to return some territory in 1938 and then invaded in 1940 and 41 to reconquer some more. The Japanese invaded Thailand later in the year, winning over the Thais with promise of further territorial gains. When the Japanese were defeated, the Thais retained their independence by aligning themselves with the Americans as a bulwark against the communist threat from China and the Soviet Union. Everywhere, Japanese conquest cut off European colonies from the colonial metropoles for several years, enabling resistant movements to emerge focused on independence rather than reconnecting with the imperial power. As might have happened, these colonies being full of large numbers of European settlers, there was an obvious parallel here to the impact of the Napoleonic wars, which cut off Spanish colonies in the Americas for years on end. So now in French Indochina itself, the Japanese were discredited as the result of a widespread famine in 1944 to 45, in which between 1 and 2 million out of a population of 10 million died of starvation and related diseases. The communist resistance under Ho Chi Minh, a founder member of the French Communist Party, during his years in Paris in the early 1920s, gained support by encouraging raids of food stores. After the end of the war, elections were held in 1946, giving the communist victory in central and northern Vietnam, but the French refused to accept this. And as the Cold War began, armed conflict ensued, lost by the French in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. This was already a rare guard action since conflict had broken out over the Indochina, forcing the French to begin withdrawal the previous year. So in neighboring Cambodia, the royal family had survived under French rule and declared independence at the request of the Japanese towards the end of the war. Although the French reimposed control, the disintegration of their Indo-Chinese empire led to a negotiated independence in 1953. And in Laos, the same process took place with Japanese conquest followed by a declaration of independence. French reoccupation and French withdrawal in 1953. So in all of these places, the Japanese invasion had given the impetus to independent movements already in existing, but previously without a great deal of influence. The sight of Europeans arrested, interned, and maltreated by the Japanese, as in this illustration that's in front of you, at an internment camp in the Dutch East Indies, destroyed any lingering sense of deference to them or sense of European superiority. So this in front of you, as I said, is an internment camp during the Japanese occupation of the Dutch East Indies. For more than 3 years, women and children lived in filthy, overcrowded Japanese internment camps. Now we're going to look at Britain's promise of eventual self-government. So how were the seeds of self-government sown in early colonies? So this involved promises of eventual self-government and funding to improve the quality of life of those living under the crown. Importantly, Britain was not only selling this idea to the colonies, Britain was selling it to the United States too. In India, the British government promised to increase the participation of Indians in the government and to eventually grant self-government. This promise was made through the Montague Chelmsford reforms in 1919. The reforms led to the establishment of a bicameral legislature, which included Indian representation and gave Indians great control over some aspect of governance. However, it fell short of Indian expectations for full self-rule. In line with the government policy contained in the Montagu Statement, August 1917, the government announced further constitutional reforms in January 1918, known as the Montagu-Chelmsford or Montford reforms. The Montagu-Chelmsford reforms were reforms introduced by the British government in India to introduce self-governing institutions gradually in India. The reforms take their name from Edwin Samuel Montagu, the Secretary of State for India during the later parts of World War I, and Lord Chelmsford, Viceroy of India between 1916 and 1921. The reforms were outlined in the Montagu-Chelmsford Report prepared in 1918 and formed the basis of the Government of India Act in 1919. So now in Africa, the British government promised to recognize the rights of Africans and to improve their quality of life through the issuance of the 14 points by British Prime Minister David Lloyd George in 1918. These points promised to uphold the principle of self-determination for African people and to improve their access to education and healthcare. In Palestine, the British government promised to support the establishment of a Jewish homeland through the Balfour Declaration of 1917. This declaration stated that the British government would use its best endeavor to facilitate the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. In general, these promises of eventual self-government and funding to improve the quality of life of those living under the Crown during the war was seen as a way for the British government to maintain its imperial control while placating nationalist sentiments in various territories and colonies. However, the extent to which these promises were fulfilled varied, and many people continued to push for greater autonomy and self-rule. So during the war itself, in an effort to win favor and support from the United States, Britain was forced to make a number of commitments concerning the empire. For instance, in 1941, even before the United States entered the war, President Roosevelt extracted from the Prime Minister Winston Churchill the acknowledgement that all people had the right to determine how they should be governed, which was contained within the Atlantic Charter. Part of the process of appeasing American critics was to make promises about the political future of India and other colonial dependencies. So Britain saw itself as a force of political and economic development, that it was essentially progressive, working towards democracy, education, and global and multiracial partnership, that it was essentially politically liberal. They saw themselves as a force of good. This was not exactly new. The British missionaries and abolitionists thought along the same lines, those who were civilizing missions. So this concept of a liberal, even democratic empire, what one historian has called People's Empire, playing on the idea of the Second World War as Britain's People's War, took hold as never before among colonial policymakers at this time. As early as 1940, the British government passed the Colonial Development and Welfare Act, committing large sums of money to the idea of funding development projects in colonial areas, particularly in Africa. This resulted in the next 10 years in millions of pounds being spent on new infrastructure projects in Britain's dependencies, on education, on hospitals, on the building of roads. This was really the birthplace of today's development aid, as you can imagine. New ideas about an empire of welfare and development echoed new thinking on economic planning and welfare policies in Britain too. An important thing to raise here is that fascism became increasingly taboo in Europe because of the nature it had taken in Nazi Germany. They stopped emphasizing explicit notions of biological racism. They were suggesting that all people were equal under Britain. They delegitimized the idea of white superiority, but this did not do away with racism. So next, we are going to be looking at the birth of the British Commonwealth. So the language of welfare and political development and the wider rejection of a politics of biological racism came to structure the trajectory of British decolonization. It contributed to the birth of a new concept of the British Commonwealth, which took hold in the 1950s and 1960s, in which new independent nations were expected to retain their close trade links with Britain and remain in peaceful and happy cooperation even after independence. So, in this, it was imagined that they would all share a commitment to certain economic and political principles, such as parliamentary democracy and capitalism. Alongside this development aid, as well as military aid from Britain, continued after independence, in part as means to ensure friendly relations with these new states. So the Commonwealth was established in 1931 with the signing of the Statute of Westminster, which recognized the autonomy of the self-governing dominions within the British Empire. Over time, the organization expanded to include former colonies and protectorates, many of which became independent countries. So in 1950s, 1960s, many Commonwealth countries gained independence from Britain, including Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Ghana, Nigeria, Tanzania, Kenya. The Commonwealth provided a forum for these newly independent countries to cooperate and engage with each other and to address common challenges. The vision of a post-war Commonwealth was an incredibly idealistic vision in which Britain would become a sort of moral leader, not relying on economic dominance or military aggression. The actual reality of the post-war Commonwealth did not fit the ideal. There were tensions, uncertainties, problems quickly arose, especially between the racist governments in South Africa and Rhodesia and the newly independent Black African nations. Even more, in economic terms, the Commonwealth never lived up to Britain's expectations. So we are going to be looking at political search for independence. So the political search for independence often began during the interwar years, as I said earlier, and fructified within the 15 years of the end of World War II in 1945. In all of this time, Africa did not go untouched by this gruesome war. Fighting took place in two regions of Africa: the Horn, which is a peninsula situated in the northeast of the African continent, and North Africa. Countries that were not physically marred by the fighting did not go unscathed by the effects of the World War either. Millions of Africans from everywhere on the continent fought and died in bloody battles of World War II. In both World War I and World War II, millions of Africans were drafted to fight. They were fighting a war against German imperialism. They were fighting for the freedom of the Allied powers. They were fighting a war to free these European countries when they themselves could barely consider themselves free. The irony was not lost to Africans everywhere. While some could claim that World War II was not Africa's war, they fought regardless. If they had not participated, many lessons learned would have been lost. The Second World War was instrumental in arming Africans with the military knowledge and the leadership skills they would utilize when fighting for their own independence. An important military skill that Africans learned throughout the world wars was that of communication and the ability to work together. One of the many reasons Africa was colonized by European countries was due to the lack of unity among African countries and its peoples. At the beginning of European colonialism, countries within Africa were often fighting themselves, while at the same time they were also fending off European imperialism. So while Europe could focus her attention on military almost exclusively on her imperial activities overseas without any distraction at home, African states and countries had their attentions divided. After World War II, this lack of unification was no longer an issue. This bondage formed a common goal to fight for freedom and independence. This unification strengthened African nationalism. The larger a group is, the more likely they were to be heard. So African nationalists made sure their voices were heard around the world. This helped tear down European colonialism in Africa. So it should be noted that there were many formerly independent countries, such as Iran and China, whose leaders considered themselves to have been informally and quasi-legally subordinated to colonial powers and who viewed their efforts for autonomy as part of the anti-imperialist movement. Therefore, decolonization represented not only the transference of legal sovereignty, but a movement for moral justice and political solidarity against imperialism. It thus refers both to the anti-imperialist political movement and to an emancipatory ideology which sought or claimed to liberate the nation and humanity itself. So even with these specifications, decolonization varied sufficiently from country to country. So now we are going to look at the beginning of this movement, what I call the beginning of this movement. So if we can pinpoint a particular event to symbolize the beginning of this movement, it would be the victory of Japan over Russia in the War of 1905, which was widely hailed as the first victory of the dominated peoples against an imperial power. Sun Yat-sen, the father of Chinese nationalism, reminisced about this event in a speech he made in Japan in 1925. He was on a ship crossing the Suez Canal soon after news of the Japanese victory became known. When the ship was docked in the canal, a group of Arabs mistook him for a Japanese, and they enthusiastically flocked around him. Even upon discovering their mistake, they continued to celebrate their solidarity with him against the imperial powers. In the speech, Sun developed the theme of a racial or color war against the white race, for whom blood is thicker than water, and urged the oppressed Asians of common color and culture to unify and resist imperialism. So, despite the Allied victory, there were key events in the Second World War that contributed to the loss of faith in British authority. The most obvious example is the fall of Singapore. The fall of British forces to Japanese dramatized the loss of British military superiority in the region. John Darwin, who is a British historian and academic who specializes in the history of British Empire, has called the loss of Singapore in 1942 to the Japanese as the real beginning of the end of empire. Prime Minister Winston Churchill described it at the time the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. It was without a doubt a major humiliation for the British, which is often seen as fatally damaging British prestige in Asia. In Britain, the loss of Singapore induced a great deal of soul searching, leading to the conclusion that Britain's style of pre-war colonial rule had failed. This was proven because the local population appeared happier to live under the Japanese occupation rather than under British colonial rule. So, on top of this, Australia and New Zealand responded to the evidence of British weakness in the Far East by turning increasingly to the United States for defense protection in the post-World War years. The war, what it did, it had revealed the strengths and weaknesses of the imperial system. It required a shift in the ideologies of empire, but perhaps most basically of all, it had been increasingly expensive. By the end of the Second World War, Britain had lost around 1/4 of its national wealth. It was heavily, heavily indebted to the United States. And interestingly, at precisely the moment when Britain appeared weakest and perhaps no longer able to hold on to great power status, the British government turned to the empire, to colonial resources as means to help rebuild the British economy. So under the Labour Party, after 1945, the British government argued it had an incentive to hold onto its colonies as never before, not the expensive ones like India, but those that could be cheaply maintained and in which resources and markets could further develop. Again, India was not one of these. Violence between the Hindu majority and the Muslim minority had escalated to the point that Britain could not control. The call for independence involved massive protests and strike too. By 1947, pressures on Britain's financial and military resources became too much to bear in India, and the Labour government announced that Britain would withdraw. We see the same thing occurring in Palestine too. But these withdrawals did not exactly signal the Labour government's abandonment of the imperial system. In fact, these retreats were intended to strengthen it, shedding parts Britain. They were just shedding parts that Britain could basically not control. Okay. So now we are going to look at the Cold War, connecting decolonization to the Cold War. So in 1947, I want us to turn to another aspect of decolonization, something I want you guys to comprehend today, as I said, which is connecting decolonization to the Cold War. So for Britain, it was particularly important that India and Pakistan agreed in 1947 to join the British Commonwealth, and so retain links with Britain and the West. Again, from the government's perspective, provided ex-colonies joined the Commonwealth, decolonization would merely mean adjusting the nature of the imperial system. So the Commonwealth was also imagined as a means to ensure the loyalty of newly independent states to the West against Soviet influence. It was seen as a possible weapon in the Cold War. So, one of the most significant consequences of this conflict was the process of decolonization, which saw many former colonies gain their independence from European colonizers. So, the Cold War and decolonization were two strands that happened in parallel. The Cold War and decolonization happened in roughly the same period of time. They were they were to many people one experience rather than two. They each influenced the way the other developed. For these reasons, we tend to study these two trends together. So the Cold War played a significant role in shaping the process of decolonization, particularly in Africa and Asia. Many of these former colonies gained their independence during the 1950s and 1960s, a period when the Cold War was at its height. The newly independent states often had to choose between aligning themselves with the United States or the Soviet Union, and this decision could have significant implications for their economic and political development. In many ways, the Cold War began before the Second World War even ended. The leaders of the big victorious powers, especially the United States and the Soviet Union, but also Great Britain, met several times during the last years of the Second World War. They tried to figure out what the post-World War would look like. The last meeting between the Allied powers during the war was held in Yalta, Russia, in February 1945. The US and the USSR and Great Britain attended. It became clear to many people that this meeting was really about dividing much of the world into what? Two separate spheres. One would be communist and Soviet dominated, and the other capitalist and US dominated. So we had communist and Soviet dominated and capitalist and US dominated. So in the image, we see the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the US President Franklin Roosevelt and the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin meeting at the Yalta Conference in Russia, public domain. So the overlap between the decolonization of the Cold War timelines. So in 1947, the US President Harry Truman said he would support anti-communist government anywhere in the world. What followed was a series of confrontations. They began with a Soviet blockade in Berlin, Germany in 1949. The victory of communist forces in China in 1949 helped spread this conflict to Asia. So this resulted in the Korean War in 1950-1953. Also in 1953, the US supported military leaders overthrew the Prime Minister of Iran, whom they suspected of supporting the Soviet Union. In early 1956, communist rebels in Cuba overthrew a US-aligned government. The conflict quickly expanded in Central America and Caribbean. Now, at the same time, much of the world was decolonizing. That is, societies everywhere were rejecting their colonizers. They were becoming independent, self-ruling nation states. Movements to end colonialism had been in motion for a long time, but they only really took hold at the end of the Second World War. When Italy was defeated in 1945, some former Italian colonies, including Libya, became independent. Similarly, the former Japanese colony of Korea became two independent countries, although dominated by the US in South Korea and the Soviet Union in North Korea. So now in the late 1940s, a few other countries began to win their independence, including the Dutch colony of Indonesia in 1949. Probably the biggest change was the successful independence of the British colony of India in 1948. A partition allowed Pakistan to be its own country. In 1954, the French colony of Indochina, made up of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, a Vietnamese force defeated the French military at Dien Bien Phu. Vietnam became independent with elections planned for 1956. So throughout the 1960s, US supported forces and Soviet forces faced each other across the border between Eastern and Western Europe. Meanwhile, the conflict spread to Southeast Asia. US forces supported southern Vietnam as communist China, and the Soviets supported northern Vietnam. Now, in the late 1970s, the Cold War confrontations really flared in southern Africa, but also picked up steam in the Americas. Both of these regional conflicts continued into the 1980s. So the communist government of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union collapsed between 1989 and 1991. Colonized people everywhere took heart from these events. This was especially so in North Africa, where decolonization movements gained power. In 1957, Ghana became the first independent sub-Saharan African country. The Year of Africa, 1960, saw 17 colonies gain independence from the British, French, and Belgian imperial powers. Then over in the Caribbean, Jamaica won its independence in 1962, as did many other islands soon after. But the process was slowed where there were European settlers in southern Africa in particular. It continued into the early 1990s. So in the image we see Prime Minister Julius Nyerere celebrates decolonization in Tanganyika, or later would be known as Tanzania. And if you go back to the timeline, which starts on our slide 21, if you go back and look at the timeline, how it coincided, you will see a remarkable overlap between the decolonization and the Cold War timelines. You can write the timeline out so you can see how the dates overlap in between decolonization and the Cold War. So next, we are going to I'm going to further unpack other ways the Cold War and decolonization became further entangled. So the first entanglement was that each trend was linked by the action of the leaders of anti-colonial movements. So leaders of the anti-colonialist movement and veterans of the Second World War were always looking for allies to help them achieve independence for their own colony. They found that their own struggle was happening in the battlegrounds of a different conflict between two great powers. So naturally, they thought that one or both of those powers might help them. So many leaders of decolonization movements tried to get either the United States or the Soviet Union on their side. Leaders who leaned towards socialism turned to the Soviet Union, China, or Cuba. Many truly believed that communism was a model for their own nation's development. others just felt that since the United States was aligned to the big imperial powers, in many cases they are former colonizers, the Soviets were actually their best chance for support. So the United States was allied, with many of the great empires, such as Britain and France. So recruiting their help with decolonization needed a different approach. Other more conservative anti-colonial leaders appealed to the United States for support. They said that as leaders of newly independent nations, they could help stop the spread of communism in their region. So during the Cold War, of course, that was the number one item on the American wish list. So now entanglement two was that the Cold War and decolonization were also linked by the actions of the two superpowers. So the US proclaimed that it supported democracy and free markets. The Soviet Union promised to liberate workers from the shackles of capitalist imperial rule. That meant both the US and the USSR could be recruited to help anti-colonial movements. Both superpowers declared themselves to be anti-empire, though some historians argue that they were really building empires of their own. The Soviets, the Soviets treated Eastern European states almost like colonies and often tried to dominate their allies around the world. The United States practiced a kind of informal imperialism where they replaced leaders they did not like in other countries. Patrice Lumumba in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Salvador Allende in Chile were prime examples. So now, as a result, many leaders of independence movements in the 1960s and 1970s tried to be non-aligned, to not pick a side, but in the end, many of these leaders faced interference from either the Americans or the Soviets, so they had to turn to the other side for help anyway. Whether you were a superpower or the leader of an independent movement, you needed allies. That is how the Cold War and the decolonization became so deeply entangled. So the different perspectives. So again, from the perspectives of many people engaged in these struggles, the Cold War and decolonization seemed to be one experience, not two separate things. So a farmer in Vietnam supporting her country's independence from French rule likely saw the intervention of the United States forces in the 1960s as just a continuation of colonial rule by Western powers. It would not have felt like something new. So another example is when Angola fighters in southern Africa saw Cuban military forces armed with Soviet material arriving in the 1970s, and they believed they were there to help them achieve their independence. In reality, Cuba and the Soviet Union's main motivation were their own Cold War struggle against the United States. In each case, there were multiple motives for the events that were happening, but as historical narratives go, it really amounts to one series of events. So, looking back, historians are able to separate these two long conflicts because we can see different motives from different people, right? It seems so obvious that the Cold War was a fight between two superpowers with different economic systems and a desire for supremacy. We can also clearly see how and why people in colonies craved independence, but at the same time, decolonization and the Cold War were as entangled as two forest vines. Okay, so British government um, deemed certain territories not yet ready for independence. So, despite these optimistic views of newly independent states in a pro-West, pro-American Commonwealth of Nations, by the late 1940s and 1950s, Britain found itself engaged in a series of colonial wars or emergencies in areas that Britain deemed not ready for independence, in Malaya, in Kenya, and in Cyprus. In Kenya in the 1950s, the Mau Mau uprising was launched against British colonial rule with the aim of securing Kenya's independence. However, the British government saw the situation differently and believed that the country was not ready for self-rule. This led to a brutal and protracted conflict between the Mau Mau guerrilla fighters and the British forces, resulting in the deaths of thousands of Kenyans and a significant amount of damage to the country's infrastructure. Another example of a territory deemed not ready for independence was Northern Ireland. The British government viewed Northern Ireland as being too unstable and too deeply divided along religious and political lines to govern itself effectively. This led to the implementation of direct rule by the British government, which was initially intended to be a temporary measure but lasted for several decades. The conflict in Northern Ireland, known as the Troubles, resulted in thousands of deaths and injuries on both sides, as well as a significant amount of damage to infrastructure and the economy. We can see on the image British troops in Belfast in 1971. So in both cases, the decision by British government to deem these territories not yet ready for independence was met with opposition from those who believed that self-rule was long overdue. This led to conflicts that were often violent and which had long-lasting effects on the countries involved. The belief that some territories were not yet ready for independence was often based on a variety of factors such as economic stability, political maturity, and social cohesion. However, it is important to note that this belief was often misguided, and in many cases, it was used to justify for maintaining colonial control over these territories. The resulting conflicts were often brutal and long-lasting, and they continued to have an impact on these countries to this day. So, though um, Americans have been heavily critical of British colonial rule before and during the Second World War, interestingly, by the 1950s, they were willing to see it as a useful barrier to the spread of communist influence in the world. For instance, it suited Americans very much that Britain fought a long military campaign against communist insurgents in Malaya between 1948 and 1960. Critically, Britain attempted to control the nature of independence, and nationalist revolts that would lead to a communist state was perceived as unacceptable. So the British emergencies enabled Britain to prove to American allies that it was doing its bit in the Cold War. The only real key moment when British imperialist interests were out of step with the American Cold War policy was over the Suez Canal. When Britain attempted to retake control of the canal from Egyptian nationalists, the US opposed this because they believed that these Egyptian nationalists were an essential ally in the Middle East. Britain was forced mainly due to US financial pressure to retreat. This is regarded like the fall of Singapore as a major historical event in the history of British decolonization, a moment when it seems to be proven that Britain cannot act outside American foreign policy interests. By the by the early to mid 1960s, the Commonwealth had become less a means to merely ensure that British or American economic interests remained intact, and more a lobbying group against the racist politics that remained in white Africa. In many ways, new Commonwealth members transformed the initiatives of the Commonwealth. Racism in South Africa was increasingly looking like a political liability for the Commonwealth. So we're going to be looking at Britain's embrace of nuclear defense. So now by 1957, British defense planning was based squarely on possession of the hydrogen bomb. This made it possible for the first time since the Second World War to end conscription in Britain, but this also shifted imperial policy too. By this point, guerrilla warfare was no longer sustainable. Britain simply would not have the manpower to sustain it. This is a compelling reason why Britain very quickly withdrew from the colonies. In the early 1960s, suddenly and remarkably, a long list of colonies took independence during this time, especially in Africa. Again, these new states joined the Commonwealth and, as partners of this multiracial Commonwealth, transformed its politics. The meaning of this once colonial partnership was remade. The British government believed that possession of the hydrogen bomb was essential for maintaining the country's status as a great power, deterring potential adversaries, and ensuring national security. Next up, we're going to look at the Badong Conference, which is an Asian African conference in 1955. So similarly, the event symbolizing the culmination of this movement was the Padang Conference. So it was a meeting of representatives of 29 new nations of Asia and Africa held in Padang, Indonesia in 1955, 50 years after the Russo-Japanese War. The conference aimed to express solidarity against imperialism and racism and promote economic and cultural cooperation among these nations. China, India, and Indonesia were key players in the meeting. The conference finally led to the Non-Aligned Movement in 1961, a wider Third World force in which participants vowed their distance from the two superpowers, aligning themselves neither with the United States or the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The core principles of the Padang Conference were political self-determination, mutual respect for sovereignty, non-aggression, non-interference in internal affairs, and equality. These issues were of central importance to all participants in the conference, most of which had recently emerged from colonial rule. So the governments of Burma, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka co-sponsored the Padang Conference, and they brought together an additional 24 nations from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Because the decolonization process was still ongoing, the delegates at the conference took it upon themselves to speak for other colonized peoples, especially in Africa, that had not yet established independent governments. So the delegates built up the five principles of peaceful coexistence working out in negotiations between India and China in 1954 as they sought to build solidarity among recently independent nations. So of the 29 nations that were represented at the Bandung Conference, six were from Egypt, from Africa, which were Egypt, Ethiopia, called the Gold Coast, which is present-day Ghana, Liberia, Libya, and Sudan. The leading contributors of the Padang Conference were the nations of Burma, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. The primary organizer was the Razlan Abdul Ghani, former Prime Minister of Indonesia. So here's a quote, which is basically a summary of the rationale for holding the conference, which is the 1955 Padang Conference was one of the most important conferences held in the 20th century. It's also one of the least well known. Leaders of the major independent Asian and African countries gathered at this Indonesian city from April 1955. There, they first set in motion the concept of South-South solidarity. Newly independent countries of Africa and Asia gathering to seek common ground. It was a French writer who dubbed this group the Third World. It was at the United Nations where the new independent government began to found common ground, but it was in Badang where it began. So Badang conference is actually quite important. The declaration, next up we're going to look at the declaration on promotion of world peace and cooperation. So now, despite cultural, ideological, historical, and political differences among the delegates, a 10-point declaration on the promotion of world peace and cooperation is adopted, which included the following principles. The first one being respect for fundamental human rights and the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. The second one, respect for the sovereignty and territorial integration of all nations. The third one, recognition of the equality of all races and the equality of all nations, large and small. Number four, abstention from intervention or interference in the internal affairs of another country. The fifth one being respect of the right of each nation to defend itself singly or collectively in conformity with the Charter of the United Nations. The sixth one being abstention from the use of arrangements of collective defense to serve any particular interest of big power, abstention by any country from exerting pressure on other countries. The seventh one, refraining from acts of threat or aggression or the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any country. The eighth being settlement of all international disputes by peaceful means, such as negotiation, conciliation, arbitration, or judicial settlements, as well as other peaceful means of the parties' own choice in conformity with the Charter of the United Nations. The ninth one being the promotion of mutual interest and cooperation, and the last one, respect for justice and international obligation. So in the image you see leaders at the Badang in 1955. You can see Nahru, Nkrumah, Nisa, Sukarno, and Tito. Nationalism, self-determination, anti-colonialism, and anti-imperialism, and the spirit of cooperation were emphasized in these talks. The position of Japan in this new projected international and regional relations was difficult to read clearly. Japan was still strongly allied to the United States politics. Japan became the closest ally of the United States after 1952. Foreign relations and their international relations. It did not adhere to the ideas of non-alignment. In fact, it was antagonistic to this movement. But at the same time, Japan was obliged to work with countries which have adopted the non-alignment as their policy guidelines in the international relations. However, conflicts developed among these non-aligned nations, for instance, between India and China in 1962, which unfortunately eroded the solidarity of the Badong spirit. With the dissolution of the socialist bloc and the end of the Cold War in 1989, the non-aligned movement, this in reality had included both truly neutral countries and those that were aligned with one or the other superpower, thus became irrelevant. So the following decade, as decolonization progressed and friction among the conference's members increased, the concept of Asian African solidarity became less and less meaningful. Major splits among the sponsors of the original conference emerged in 1961 and again in 1964 and 1965, when China and Indonesia pressed for a second Asian-African conference. In both instances, India, together with Yugoslavia and the United Arab Republic, Egypt, succeeded in organizing rival conferences of non-aligned states that refused to take a strong anti-Western position urged by China, and in 1964-65 by Indonesia. In November 1964, the Second Asian African Conference, to have been held in Algiers, Algeria, was indefinitely postponed, and it appeared unlikely that the Badang Conference would ever have a successor. But nevertheless, the Badang Conference actually gave a voice to emerging nations and also demonstrated that they could be a force in future world politics inside or outside the Cold War framework. So the criticisms of Ame Caesar, and other anti-colonialist theorists developed a new global politics against white supremacy. In the context of the Cold War, the African American freedom struggle and anti-colonial thinking combined as global politics of liberation against empire. Again, this emerged in the context of the Cold War. One important aspect of this global politics was called Third Worldism, a refusal to be under the umbrella of either the First World of the West or the Soviet Union. So this was a new assertive global politics that emphasized Afro-Asian solidarity against the Cold War divides. So Caesar and other anti-colonial intellectuals contributed to a language of opposition to white supremacy. Importantly, anti-colonial ideas and institutions such as the Indian Workers Association and the Afro-Asian Solidarity Committee fed into anti-racist campaigning in Britain. The secondary decolonization of the British Caribbean, for instance, Jamaica's emerging cultural politics of Black liberation found in Rastafarianism deeply informed Britain's Black Power movement and Britain's Black cultural arts movement. Anti-colonialism deeply informed the ongoing fight against cultural marginalization and systematic discrimination in Britain in the 1970s and 1980s. In this sense, with the end of empire, Black liberation was just beginning. Thank you so much for attending this lecture. We will continue with this lecture in part 2, where we're going to be focusing on decolonization in Africa.